Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California on KLRB. It's tape number 459, September 21st, 1980. We're having a little difficulty in the recording studio of getting these tapes synchronized with the machines turning them on in the other room while I'm on the air, so forgive the double introduction in case the tape cassette has it this time. This is the 4th anniversary of the murder of Orlando Letelier, the ex-envoy from Chile to the United States, and Ronnie Moffett. They were murdered in a car on Embassy Row. There is a good book out on murder on Embassy Row telling about this assassination inside the United States. I thought about them. I was looking up some articles about Frank Turple and an agent of the CIA named Mr. Wilson who was involved with that murder plan on Embassy Row. There's a good book out about the murder on Embassy Row. The two of the men that were charged with that murder have been released, and there's a suggestion of a new trial. For the time being, they have been taken out of jail. It seems that the informants in the case, two of them were cellmates, so on a technicality, two people that killed Letelier and Moffett are now out, and they're asking for, as I say, for a new trial. There's so many events in American history, such as Kent State, the Letelier murder, and the John Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King's murder, Malcolm X. I added up into the hundreds, and it's good sometimes to remember those sad events. They're very much a part of our American system. Last week, I told you that I would discuss just briefly why I wasn't at Amnesty International. I've been working for the census since last April, and I didn't want to announce it on the air until I turned in my PIN. Our work actually terminated this Friday afternoon. If I were to say that I was working for the federal government in the census capacity, a lot of people may say she's too political or radical. We didn't discuss politics as an enumerator working in the office. That wasn't a thing we were supposed to do, but it was very valuable for me to work in that capacity these past months and to understand how the census works and the way it's compiled. The best way to understand something is to be a part of it, and I certainly was a part of it for many months. Some of the experiences were wonderful. I didn't run into any bureaucracy or any difficulty with personnel. I was told I would probably find a lot of people uptight. The people were just marvelous, and the work was interesting, and I was able to go all through the Carmel Valley and part of Salinas and down to Big Sur and meet all kinds of people and see all kinds of circumstances on the Monterey Peninsula that gave me a broader understanding of where I live. I do believe after completing this amount of time from April to September, working with the census, that if people were told about the Census Bureau and the way it works, that they would demand that every single form be destroyed tomorrow. The forms now are packed in the packing house, and they'll be shipped out tomorrow to California. And then some go to Indiana, and some go to New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm very apprehensive about the Indiana collection because of Senator Lugar, the Tom Charles Houston plan, the COINTEL program that was set up by Richard Nixon, the Defense Department, the National Security Agency, and the FBI and CIA. The headquarters for that was in Indiana, and Bloomington, Indiana was the think tank for domestic counterintelligence for Operation Chaos that formed the SLA with Emily and William Harris and Gary and Angela Atwood that came out to California to infiltrate the Indian movement and the Black Panthers and the United Prisoner Workers and the gay activists, the lesbians, the gays, all of the political activists, the Peace and Freedom Party, the Venceremos, every political group was infiltrated and broken up, and the SLA was an excuse by the CIA to break into these groups and break them up. Just one brief explanation about the way the census works. We took an oath when we began the work, but I don't have to reveal names or people. What happens, but the principle should be known to everybody. I think they have a right to know how it works. Taking in this geographical area, the one that I worked in, the state is broken into a group of numbers. I don't know how many, but our district office was a certain number, 3220, and that took from Santa Cruz down to San Luis Obispo and this area of California. And then That is broken into about 1,100 different sections, and then each section or book of those 1,100, the enumerators go out to the homes or places where people can't be located. About 70% send in their forms, and then it's the job of the enumerator to find the other 30% or the vacant homes. And each person has a name and a number and a block number, and he's identified on the map instantly, so that from this time on, within 5 minutes, I think anybody in the United States who has filled in a form or has a post office box or a Social Security number probably could be identified very quickly. The disturbing thing was that if you take a residence, for example, say my home, Mae Brussell, and you put in a computer in alphabetical order into Carmel, California, like the telephone directory, and you look up a street via Crotolo, and you have a map, the fourth house on the map on the right side of the street is me. And every person's home is a number on a map, and every person has a number. And the maps accompany the books to their destination, and they're done over very accurately so that we're all pinpoint on a map. If you have 11 whites and one black and then 11 whites, the one black person is singled in that neighborhood, and neighborhoods are marked. And I have an article that was in the Washington Post last week that the Army is going to use the census forms for recruiting certain areas and the kind of people that would be desirable. I saw how quickly it worked to locate a particular person in a barracks where the number was off by one number, and within less than 4 minutes you could correct the error. So there's a lot of people in Carmel Valley that are proud of their privacy. They live on certain streets where there's no name on the mailbox and no number on the mailbox, and they have a P.O. box in Carmel or Carmel Valley, and they think that they have a lot of privacy, and you go to their home, and they pride themselves in that. But the map has a serial number for that house, and the name at the end of the census period matches that house, so that no matter how much privacy they think they have from that moment on, they are a name, and it matches the dot. And other agencies do work with the census, and so when the books are completed and wrapped up, they're identified exactly on the map where they live. The most frightening thing of all, I thought, was some of the foster homes, the care centers for older people. Some you can go in or out, and they don't mind you're coming to the door. Some you can't get past the door. They look like homes that are run by churches, and it reminds me of Jonestown. And one of them has a chain fence, and I'll do more work on that later. I don't want to talk too much about the Census Bureau. One interesting thing, I thought it was interesting, but it could be equally frightening, was numbering the members of the Indian tribes. There's a list of about 1,300 tribes, and they are not identified by name. They're, after the name is put down by particular members of the Indian tribes, they're transcribed into codes for computers. They can be used for good, to study these tribes and to study anthropology and American citizens, or they could be used for evil. I understand that 1/3 of the American Indians are now sterilized, and I always see the danger in these things more than the good. I suppose I shouldn't, but after Nazi Germany, you can't be too careful. And I feel that people were guaranteed privacy. I never did say that when I went around as a enumerator. I never said, if you tell me the information, I guarantee it won't be revealed for 75 years. I wouldn't say that because I don't know who receives it. Humans take the information and they pass it on to other humans, and not everybody is very nice. So I never forced anybody and never coaxed them to fill out a form. And one of the interesting things was doing the research and knowing how bad things are in this country. Finding the 30% that resisted mailing in the forms, I was wondering the temper of the times. And most people are very complacent, and they're easygoing, and they're not nervous or angry, and they're not paranoid, and they're willing to give information, and they give more than you want or need, and they're generous and let you in the home. And I think out of 12 books, which I had with hundreds and hundreds of names, I got 4 refusals, and when I went back, the other 2 were perfectly willing to fill in whatever information there was, and they seemed agreeable and, as I say, complacent. And I expected more anger or hostility, but I didn't get it. And maybe that's good, and maybe it's bad. Maybe people are accepting things more than they should and should be aroused, but that wasn't my role. My role was to locate the home and how many people live there and that's what I did. And then I found some very interesting things that maybe from time to time I'll refer to, but not this evening. I did mention last week the problem of the narcotic war between the two candidates, the control of the opium traffic between the Carter people, the Reagan people, and that running for president of the United States simply means covering your turf geographically that's sliced up between the major candidates and who's going to get a piece of the action. And I gave some very modest figures of the cost of crime. One of the subscribers to these radio tapes sent me a copy of Forbes. I don't know if you can get the magazine stands or not, or by subscription. If you can get it, or go to the library, September 29th, 1980. And on the cover, there is an article. It says, "Organized crime, unregulated, untaxed, and unstoppable." Now, many of you hopefully think that I'm going to talk about the presidential debates tonight between John Anderson and Ronald Reagan. I think the debates are a terrible bore. The questions border on a possibility of getting some answers. The answers are vague. They don't deal, when they talk about inflation, with the organized crime inflating property or the increased cost of the payoffs and the arson. And the mob rule that has taken over in the major cities and in the small towns, too, where the mob has come in. Forbes has a breakdown of organized crime and describes it as a perfectly non-taxable, non-stoppable industry of $150 billion a year, chemicals being $149 billion, and then the auto industry down to $125 billion. And I see organized crime as the biggest threat to our freedom in this country and to our economic security. A lot of this untaxable money that they get, this $150 billion, is put into real estate, into hotels, into recreation, to campgrounds, to trucking for produce and food coming in, and into arson, burning down, and stealing cars, and loan sharking. This industry that is non-taxable, and the money is put over into foreign banks and then brought back and laundered and put into investments in our own hometowns, is running the people out of town who saved money, worked all their life, invested in their piece of property, and now the taxes are up on the property. They're taxed out, can't afford it, and income people of organized crime will put down $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 on a piece of property that maybe in somebody's old age or in their expectations would be $60,000, $70,000. The young people can't afford homes, and this huge hunk of money is unlimited for people in the organized crime businesses. They refer to garbage collection, jukeboxes, and marijuana and narcotics and so forth. There was a convention or a group that had a report last week in Philadelphia on organized crime. They said 60 million tons of narcotics were brought into the United States in 1980, 10 million the year before, 60 million last year. And in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, they put out a report that I want to send for the Crime Commission, called it A Decade of Organized Crime, just on the Pennsylvania Mafia groups and 14 other groups in New York and New Jersey, and it lists the crime families. But all these statistics still don't go into what happens to the rural areas, the small towns, the private businesses, the mom-and-pop stores that are being squeezed out, the payoffs under the table, the cost of delivering the produce, the cost of manufacturing things that you wear and need. The crime figures have never been brought up to any of the candidates and never will, and yet they affect our lives, and the answers that they give to inflation and to savings and so forth are so general. They can use the same time-worn phrases over and over again for every election, but they don't address themselves to the basic needs of people, which are being affected by this $120 billion industry that is totally non-taxable and has to come some way back into our lives to affect our lives. Now, Forbes, in their article, goes into the payoffs of politicians, legislatures, courtrooms, government bureaucrats, the press, the universities, the churches, legitimate businesses. If they pay off all of these groups in order to conceal their operations, and murder for hire, which is a very profitable business, the blackmail and the murdering, the crime lords are becoming the number one problem, I believe, in this country, and as the cover of Forbes says, unregulated, untaxed, and unstoppable, all because they began by paying off these politicians very long time ago. Tom Dewey and Earl Warren were part of that, Richard Nixon and his gang, and of course Joe Kennedy wasn't beyond the organized crime league. He worked with them with his liquor industry and so forth. He was part of that, and Aristotle Onassis. The top people that rub with our politicians and affect the presidents, Paul Laxalt from Las Vegas, Nevada, running the Reagan campaign, and Reagan's buddies in California, all interwoven with organized crime and assassination hit teams. The politicians are so much a part of the organized crime syndrome that they can't speak up or they'll be blackmailed and smeared, so they avoid this big problem. And that's one reason I think that these debates are such a bore, because they don't get down to the things that really affect our lives, and they're going to affect us in the future. It's going to get worse. It isn't going to get better. I got a letter from one of my tape subscribers, listeners, asking me to clarify the remark that I made about the Vietnam War and how the flower children dropped away after the war, that it wasn't really a movement. They just didn't want to go to war, and they felt sorry for the Vietnamese, but as soon as the war was over, they went into this so-called Me Too or selfish attitude and didn't continue the fight, even though the repressions got worse after the Vietnam War. Starvation around the world, and the COINTEL program at home, the Operation Chaos, the assassinations increasing in number, and so forth. I was referring specifically to what was the hippie movement, which had no substance and no real leaders, people like Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman and so forth, who were really clowns with no ideological basis, people that were sincere in what they did, like Richard Harris, who went to jail for several years and came out and is working against nuclear waste and against nuclear power now. He's very low-key and doesn't get the attention of the media that these other clowns did, who are now working on Wall Street and making a lot of money but ignoring the problems at home and overseas. What I meant, and I clarify that, is that the so-called flower power group were self-centered and found a joy in leaving home and the establishment, but didn't take the time to study history or the substance of history to know how real the problems were or how to face them when they were adults. Speaking of facing them, there's an article in the Monterey Herald this morning from the Los Angeles Times. Ex-Nazi army officer was elected this last week president of the UN Assembly. Baron Rutger von Weimar of West Germany, who fought in Rommel's Afrika Korps, was captured by the Allied troops, was proud to be a Nazi, has never apologized for it. He's 57 years old. He is now head of the United Nations. The article goes on to explain that he divided his time after World War II between diplomacy and journalism, and first was a prisoner of war in Virginia and Maryland. That's an interesting thing because many so-called war criminals lived at the farm that later became the compound and training place for terrorism and CIA assassination teams. They were brought from Germany to the United States, to Virginia and Maryland, and the Germans were then training the Americans in counterintelligence and assassination teams. This von Weimar came to the United States, to Virginia and Maryland, then went back to Germany and worked for the press agency and worked for the United Press. From 1947, the year the CIA was formed, he was the bureau chief for the news agency in Bonn. He took that over from 1954 to 1958. You can see why people like Gerald Ford, who was on the Warren Commission, Gerald Ford, in the minutes of the meeting of the Warren Commission, one of the first meetings, they asked, how will we handle the press? And Gerald Ford said, I can handle the AP and the UPI, the Associated Press and the United Press International. When the Warren Commission wanted a historian to write the account of how the President of the United States was murdered in Dallas, they called Otto Winnecker, a German, the chief historian of the Pentagon, described in the book Who's Who in the CIA, and Earl Warren and Mr. Rankin, the chief counsel of the Warren Commission, brought in Otto Winnecker. So here's a man representing the United Press International in Germany. He came over to the United Nations and, as I say, has never apologized for being a Nazi. Kurt Waldheim, the former Secretary General, claimed that he was forced to become a Nazi when Austria was annexed and he had to serve on the Eastern Front. He said he was pressed into Army service. But now, for the second time, we have a Nazi, but this one never apologized and was employed by the news media in Germany for the United Press. Also, in the Monterey Herald today was a long article on Eisenhower, A New Perspective. There have been many articles on that, and there's a photograph of Eisenhower in 1957 with Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, another German German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, and Bonn Foreign Minister Heinrich von Brentano. Eisenhower had access to world leaders, this article says, as a result of his military commanding as an officer, and he could meet with these important people. And you see John Foster Dulles, whose brother Allen Dulles had formed the CIA from the OSS, and the year of this photograph is 1957. The article goes on to say, in essence, that Allen Dulles was in daily contact with Eisenhower in the State Department. Of course, he worked closely with his brother. And it tells about some of the errors or bungling that Eisenhower made in the creative use of the CIA in their covert activities, such as overthrowing Guatemala and Iran, and their interference in Cuba and in the Congo and Indonesia, and breaking the Geneva Accords in Vietnam. And the article says that Eisenhower wasn't that mellow, sweet, aging hero. The historic version is that butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. He was just sitting back, low-key after the war. And now they look back with his documents and records and find that he had a very strong position with German officials, with the Dulles brothers, that counterintelligence was rampant. He was overthrowing countries with the counterintelligence of the CIA. He was in daily touch with the hawks in Congress, and that Eisenhower very much shaped the foreign policy of the United States after the war to assist the Germans to rearm the third time, this time against the Soviet Union. If you keep in mind the historical record of how the Versailles Treaty was betrayed, and Germany started rearming immediately after World War I, and when that war was over, World War II began, and they were rearming it. By 1943, the Americans and Germans were making deals to get ready to rearm, and they stalled that war so that they could get the money out of Germany and the treasures and the documents to get ready for World War III. If you keep that script in mind and repeat it very often, then you can understand the framework of the news as it's going on today. The picture of Eisenhower with these German officials and Dulles is interesting because, as I say, under the caption it says in 1957 he was having that conference. There was an article in the Los Angeles Times this week I've been keeping up on a man from the Beverly Hills Police Department named Captain Jack Eggers. And we transfer from Eisenhower in 1957 with the German officials to Beverly Hills, California in 1957. That was the year that Howard Hughes was taken to the Beverly Hills Hotel from 1957 to 1966, literally kidnapped by organized crime and the CIA, kept in a bungalow. Jack Eggers was supplying the narcotics and the drugs for Howard Hughes. He was the middleman to keep Hughes under lock and key while the Hughes organization and the aerospace organization was building up, again, the spy system, the U-2 planes, the satellites, the communications that are being built now for World War III. And under the Hughes organization, as I studied Hughes, every book that's been written on Howard Hughes, and the Hughes Medical Institute and the person, Howard Hughes, I realized that it was an umbrella for the Nazification of America. Now, Jack Eggers was removed from the Beverly Hills Police Department at the time of a murder of Bobby Hall. It had to do with a complicated narcotics, the supplying of narcotics for use, the narcotics for the politicians in Los Angeles, California, and Hall was collecting tape cassettes of important politicians when he was gunned down and killed. And a man who killed Bobby Hall had called Jack Eggers, the Beverly Hills police chief, who was the control man for the body of Howard Hughes, and said, "I'm going to kill Bobby," and then they called back later and said he was dead. Eggers had to resign, and then following that, a assassin from Argentina, a man who lived in Culver City but had fled to Argentina, came back and is being held for the attempted murder of Jack Eggers. Eggers caught on. There were two people that were supposed to kill Eggers. Eggers' life is probably, I wouldn't say his life expectancy is too long. Knowing what he knows, one of the men who tried to kill him got off, and the other one was charged with killing a man, a Mr. Kent Chong Wong. It's a drug deal. I don't know whether these were the drugs that went to the Hollywood scene and the Hollywood politicians or the drugs that went to Howard Hughes, but another drug-related slaying occurred that had to do with Jack Eggers and the attempt to kill Eggers, and the men are being charged with murdering one man and attempt to murder Jack Eggers. But that name is one to remember because of the importance of his being the middleman or the control man of the organization. The Summa Corporation had Hughes, who was just a figurehead who really didn't exist and wasn't seen except by the entourage around and referred to as the Mormon Mafia that took over his body and his messages until he was taken to a Boston hospital in 1966. There's a new book out on Lyndon Johnson by Merle Miller, an oral biography called Lyndon, and there's excerpts of that running in the San Jose Mercury. I haven't gotten the book yet, but the history of our times, the character of Lyndon Johnson, the Texas politics, the crime figures, the organized crime figures, his connections to Robert Vesco, and Richard Nixon are so interwoven. LBJ was the head of NASA that brought over Werner Braun Vaughan and the top Nazis for the aerospace industry that worked at Bell Helicopter and used aerospace. And there was one sentence in this book on the Kennedy assassination excerpted that just about summarizes what the researchers have to contend with. As every new history comes out, it gets more watered down. This book refers to the special commission that was appointed by Lyndon Johnson to investigate the killing of President John Kennedy. The official report, according to Merle Miller, was that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, unaided, and slightly crazed. He killed John Kennedy. There were some who refused to believe the report's full story. Lyndon Johnson was among them, believing at first it was the Vietnamese who were involved and later the Cubans who were involved. So you see, Lyndon Johnson now has the Vietnamese as a potential to the killing of John Kennedy, which is really stretching it. Maybe the Cubans, maybe the anti-Castro Cubans, but this is the first time Vietnamese were brought into Dealey Plaza or to Bethesda Hospital to do the autopsy with Marina Oswald. I hadn't heard about the Vietnamese, but every 10 or 15 years, new versions come out so that people picking up this book who haven't studied the history of the Warren Commission hearings may believe that the Vietnamese really killed John Kennedy. This evening on the debates, Bill Moyer was the moderator. Bill Moyer looks so mild. He represents public broadcasting. He's on public broadcasting all the time, Channel 9 out here. People may not realize or don't know the book that came out a long time ago, Who's Who in the CIA, lists Bill Moyer, and Bill Moyer was Lyndon Johnson's closest buddy. He was his press secretary through the whole cover-up of the Kennedy assassination and through those years in the White House of the Vietnam War. That was Bill Moyer's role. And then after that era is over of the Vietnam War, Bill Moyer comes on public radio as a so-called liberal or left, taking on the aura, say, of Ramsey Clark and Mark Lane and some of these so-called leftist concerned people. He comes on very mild. Bill Moyer is the moderator for this program, and I think the people that were involved in the cover-up of the Kennedy murder and the Vietnam War and the lies about the Holocaust in Vietnam, of Cambodia and Laos and all Southeast Asia with its massive narcotic traffic and bringing in of drugs, Air America and the CIA should not be allowed to have access to public broadcasting, much less be projected as great moderators for the youthful generation to look up to, like Dan Rather on television, or Cronkite. Rather was in Dallas at Dealey Plaza when Kennedy was killed. He described the head as going forward when the head went backwards of John Kennedy. He's always covered up and never acknowledged that there was a conspiracy there, and he's worked his way up to be one of the top broadcasters in the country. There are people over in Afghanistan that want to charge him with having several people murdered so that they can make a television documentary over there, but we wouldn't send heroes like Dan Rather to be tried for murder in order to make a movie have a murder take place. That will never happen. Speaking of murders, this last week the judge stopped the plans to open the grave of Lee Harvey Oswald. I've done many broadcasts on the Oswald doubles. Personally, and for selfish reasons, I was very pleased that the judge said that, because I spent 17 years researching Lee Harvey Oswald and the doubles, and I'm writing a book. All the research is done, and now that the census work is over, I will be spending most of my mornings and afternoons and evenings just working on that book. If the grave were opened and there was no body there would be an instant bantam book by somebody like William Stevenson, who did a book on Entebbe. We'd have instant books out that did not have the historical documents to designate the difference between the many Lee Harvey Oswalds that were floating around from 1959 to 1963. So I'm very pleased, for selfish reasons, that the grave is not going to be opened, and then maybe when I finish my book there'll be more compelling reasons to bring up the case again. An interesting point I read in one of my newspaper articles, that the judge offered to make a settlement with Michael Edos in exchange for not opening the grave. Now, I didn't realize...
Wash your dishes by hand. Don't let the...
That half hour went so fast. I have so much material to bring in. But candidates that debate certain issues that are just throwing words around are not as important as the bullets that fly that erase a particular candidate. In, as I said, 1960, Richard Nixon debated John Kennedy, and it wasn't long after Kennedy won the election that he was murdered. In 1968, Robert Kennedy was running for election. He went through the primaries in all the states, and Richard Nixon wanted to be president in 1968. In the eve of the primary, Robert Kennedy was murdered. Well, Sirhan Sirhan had a hearing before the parole board, and he'll be out in 4 years. He already has a ticket. Mr. Gaddafi has ordered him a ticket to the Middle East. He has asylum in Libya, or he can go back to Jordan, where he's a native of Jordan. He's been getting an A average. He takes 25 college credits, I guess, each semester, or has accumulated that many. He has an associate degree from Hartnell Community College. It was Edward Simpson Calas, the psychologist on the peninsula here, chief psychologist at San Quentin, who received Sirhan when he first was sent up there, who said, wait a minute, he doesn't have a low IQ, he's under a trance, he's been hypnotized. And Dr. Calas was the first one to recognize that he was not low mentally in any sense, and Sirhan is living up to that diagnosis. In fact, he is doing very well. He's in charge of certain offices. He does typing at the prison, and he wants to be somewhat removed or solitary until he gets out, which is smart. And he's keeping physically fit and getting his good grades, and he studies current and national affairs, so that 4 years from now he has a ticket and he can leave the country and he has served his time. An interesting book I've referred to before, The Vesco, the Infernal Money-Making Machine, about Bobby Vesco, has an interesting connection of Vesco to Pasadena. The Sirhan family was brought to Pasadena by a church group, Friends of Richard Nixon's, and Vesco had interest in an electrical firm in Pasadena, and he also got money, loans for businesses. The Bank of America loaned Vesco $18 million for an operation in Pasadena, and Prudential Insurance loaned him $20 million to take over an electric company, and he combined this with underworld money in the Netherlands and in Switzerland, and Bobby Vesco controlled reach from New Jersey to California, and Pasadena, California, is the area where the Bank of America had put up money for Richard Nixon, and they were also very much behind Ronald Reagan's campaign and the politics to the right. This book tells the connections of Robert Vesco from New Jersey to Wall Street to Pasadena, where the Sirhan family was, to Carlos Marcello, Santos Traficana, organized crime. And if you take a map of the United States and draw the diagrams and put under it the sources of where the money went, you can outline pretty well the traffic of the assassination teams. As the years go on, it becomes more and more clear as we read these books that come out and put the places together with the Bank of America funding him for electric company in Pasadena and Sirhan's connections in Pasadena and with the CIA and with Richard Nixon, the Vesco, Bahamas, organized crime connections. You can see easily how this group could put Richard Nixon in the White House in 1968. All they had to do was to get rid of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and their candidate was in. There was an article jumping to Nation magazine, September 20th, 1980, the last issue. There was an article about Frank Turple. When I came back on KLRB, I did mention that I thought that was one of the most important stories of the past year or two. And this article goes into the fact that while talking about the Billy Carter affair, the name of gun runner Frank Turple has been almost lost to the public. Nation says Turple is a former CIA man, a gun runner, indicted by the federal grand jury, who worked with his associate Edwin Wilson, a former CIA man. That's the Edwin Wilson that was involved with the anti-Castro Cubans and Letelier murder. And Turple was selling illegal arms to Libya and so forth, and this article tells about the role of Turple and Wilson with Gaddafi and training terrorist programs. And finally, a magazine is coming out, even though it's just 4 or 5 paragraphs, and making some connections of Frank Turple and Wilson to assassination teams. It goes on how the grand jury found them guilty or suggested they were responsible for the assassination of a former member of the Libyan Revolutionary Council, that they had hired a hitman for $1 million. That was the price to do the job, and that 9 other Libyan exiles have been assassinated. Then the article goes on to say, by his own admission, Mr. Turple trained Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, known as Carlos, the internationally wanted terrorist who is believed to have led the raid on the Israeli Olympic team in Munich in 1972. Now, Nation magazine this last week is telling about Frank Turple of the Central Intelligence Agency and Carlos and the murder of the Israeli students at the Olympic Games in 1972. I wrote in The Realist the article in 1974 called The SLA is the CIA. This was 6 years ago, and I was giving examples of CIA terrorism that look like they come from the left. And I mentioned in that article on page 38 an example of the Olympic Games massacre of Israeli athletes in Munich, Germany, and the use of Dr. Hacker, a psychologist, who was the expert on the Munich massacre and also was called in to advise Randolph Hearst on the SLA kidnapping. I wrote in 1974, the massacre in Munich was wide open for the investigation of a larger conspiracy involving the United States and German military police. Arab terrorists, in quote, kidnapped the Israelis after the German police watched them climb the fence. Dr. Hacker, who was supposed to be an expert on terrorism, wrote a book deploring violence and guerrilla movements, but he never mentioned that the secret funding behind the Arabs or elaborated that it was the Germans and Americans who murdered the Jewish athletes and not the Arabs. Dr. Hacker was a consultant and is to the Los Angeles Police Department. He worked with Donald DeFreeze as a psychiatrist when DeFreeze was working as a police informer. And when Patty Hearst was kidnapped, he moved on to Randolph Hearst's advisor. I went on in the same article and linked Saudi Arabian and Iranian oil money to Reg Murphy kidnapping in Atlanta, Georgia, to the Watergate plumbers, and said Saudi Arabian money was involved in Murphy's kidnapping and was linked to J.F. Stoner's States Right Party. Money from Iran from the Shah went into the CIA funds in Mexico. Stoner's States Right Party employs the brother of James Earl Ray, the Patsy, in the Martin Luther King murder. There is a link between the conspiracies and the provocations in the United States funds from right-wing oil companies and the SLA kidnapping and related bombings in the United States in 1974. I also wrote in that article just a paragraph below, and this has to do with Ronald Reagan and the California violences that I briefly touched upon, and maybe next week I'll get back to. I said, if the true story behind the California epidemic of violences were told, we'd know about Juan Corona, Herbert Mullen, Edmund Kemper, Charles Manson, Charles Watson, and Sirhan Sirhan. What interesting stories they would have to tell to confirm their involvement in larger conspiracies. Now, just this last week, a new trial began for Juan Corona. I mentioned him in this article. Juan Corona had been prosecuted for murdering 25 migrant farm workers, and evidence had been planted against him. There was a reason to blame him for these 25 murders, and a ledger with names of the victims was supposed to have been written by Juan Corona. The Juan Corona story and the other California violences are all part of this counterintelligence system, and I did write 6 years ago about the Olympic Games and the Israeli athletes being murdered by United States violence from the right and not from the Arab PLO, are funded by the American oil companies and the CIA and given their arms. We get articles on the terrorism, the terrible Gaddafi or Idi Amin or the PLO. They are directly funded and armed by our Central Intelligence Agency, and the psychiatrists should be looking into the American minds that provide this kind of violence and pass it off on the third world or the left. Just last week, I mentioned that Francis Turple and Mr. Wilson and George Corcola, who set up assassination teams, have fled the country. The New York Times had an article September the 11th, 1980, this last week, that Ed Wilson, former CIA, has fled to North Africa or Europe. He's been there since April. Mr. Turple, who is under indictment, has gone over to Europe. He's in the Middle East, Libya, Iraq, or Syria. Now, you see, he can be funding the Iraq government with their assassination teams and arms to irritate Khomeini and make a war on the border of Iran. These men are useful. They are the top assassination teams of the United States linked to Mitchell Warbell, the silencers, the weapons, the anti-Castro Cubans, the Omega-66, the Alpha-66, the Omega-77. In fact, they killed and claimed, their group that were trained by them from New Jersey claimed to have killed the UN agent, the man that was working at the UN last week, and they want the Cuban attaché. They murdered him on the highway there in New York City, and they claim to do more murders in the United States. They're bragging now and open about their murder, and the point is that as long as the CIA puts weapons and police departments and silencers and all the devices for murder overseas, eventually it's going to take place on our streets. It has already, and it's going to escalate, and it's something we have to watch. That attaché at the UN was only one who was ambushed. There will be others. The Omega-7 brags about it, and this is the gang that works with Corcola and Turple and killed the Jewish athletes. The Jewish community, the Anti-Defamation League, is silent. They read these things. I don't know where their head is at. They wouldn't ask one of these candidates what they would do about terrorism at home. They all seem to be asleep or zonked out. I don't know what they think about these days. Speaking of terrorism, there's a trial going on now of the FBI agents versus the weathermen illegally breaking into their homes and taping them and taking their documents and their families' homes and in their homes. And the filmmaker Emile D'Antonio accused the FBI last week of duplicating a copy of a soundtrack of a movie of the Weather Underground and using it as an excuse for the Weather Underground actually meeting. Antonio said that he made a documentary in 1975 about the weather under people and the weather people rather, and that the FBI took the soundtrack of the movie and used that as an excuse for some of their continuous harassment, as if it was actually their property to use, and they have broken into Antonio's home. He was on the enemy list of Richard Nixon. He made a wonderful movie about Richard Nixon a while back. In the remaining time, I want to go briefly into the murder of Somoza this last week. There was a cartoon by Conrad in the LA Times, Richard Nixon holding a headline saying Somoza assassinated, and he's yelling upstairs, "Pack my dark suit, Pat. I'm sure they'll want me at the funeral." Nixon didn't go to the funeral. He was busy on a yacht up at Edgartown at Chappaquiddick, the old Ted Kennedy territory where Mary Jo Kopechne was killed. But Congressman McDonald was there, and Representative Murphy, John Murphy from New York, who's under indictment for the scandal. Murphy went to school with Somoza at West Point and at prep school. Somoza was killed at a very opportune time, and when Ronald Reagan runs for office or Nixon runs for office, there is a lot of violence. The alleged assassin, the so-called assassin, was murdered right on the spot. The other 6 have departed. The Paraguay police said on the 18th of this month that the 6 escaped. A man named Hugo Alfredo Eruzin was killed. They went into his home where he was supposed to have been reading a book by Karl Marx, calmly reading the book. It reminds me of Lee Harvey Oswald with Karl Marx on the coffee table. They killed him. His alias was Captain Santiago, and I believe that this Eruzin could have been the man who set up the assassination of Somoza at this time, who did in fact come from Argentina, bordering on colonial Dignitat in Chile, part of the Operation Condor, to kill Somoza. Why was he killed at this time? In the first place, he was going to be kicked out of Paraguay. He was an embarrassment. He'd been messing around with a woman. He had one mistress for about 15 years. His wife is in the United States, in Miami. But then he took on another woman, a mistress, who was the mistress to a newspaper publisher who was married to Stroessner's daughter. It may sound a little complicated. The head of Paraguay's daughter is married to a newspaper publisher who also has a mistress that Somoza thought he could reach. Somoza's son was kicked out of Paraguay in 24 hours' notice and told never to come back, and Somoza had been living it up there in Paraguay and causing embarrassment to that very strong fascist regime, and Stroessner told him to cool it. The second reason I think he could have been knocked off at this time, he was closely linked to Representative John Murphy, as I say, under indictment for Murphy's indictment with the Abscam story, but he had brought in illegally people from Nicaragua that are still in this country and never were removed. But the anti-Castro Cubans have been using the death of Somoza for politics, and also Ronald Reagan. At the funeral service in Miami, 9,000 people attended, and they had signs out on the street, Reagan, see, Carter, no, and there were other signs, death to Carter. And while the 8,000 people were out there demonstrating, pamphlets were handed out, distributed for Ronald Reagan's campaign. Somoza used his country for the landing base and training of the Bay of Pigs operation that never went off. John Kennedy called off. And the anti-Castro Cubans have been angry about that. They depend on Somoza as their stronghold against labor movements in the entire Central America area. And Somoza is an important person, these anti-Castro Cubans. By bringing him home to Miami at this time, it was a chance for placards and weeping and mourning, and the strong Reaganites were out there handing out pamphlets saying that Monday, that's tomorrow, Ronald Reagan will be down in Miami campaigning. So they were hanging Carter in effigy, they had placards, Reagan see, and they had 8,000 plus all their families and so forth could say, Jimmy Carter let us down. He let Somoza out. He should have brought in the troops. I mentioned last week or the week before on the tapes that Carter was very brave in not sending American troops into Iran, in not sending American troops to Nicaragua, letting the Shah be removed. This is what the people wanted. The Sandinistas were celebrating in the streets that Somoza was dead. Somoza had an interesting career. The dynasty started in 1936. He came to the United States to a military academy. He graduated from West Point in 1946. That was the year Richard Nixon was going into Congress, and the CIA would be formed in 47. A year later, he was active, of course, with the CIA and the National Guard down in Central America. He married a woman from Florida in 1950, and his father was assassinated down in Nicaragua in 1956. His brother took over, and this was the landing base and the training place for the Bay of Pigs. That's where George de Mohrenschildt, Lee Harvey Oswald's close buddy and Nazi spy, pro-Nazi sympathizer, was down in Nicaragua at the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And Somoza was very active until he took over. His brother was president down there for a while. He was active with the police, the National Guard, the CIA, and our multinationals. In 1972, Somoza met a man named Vance Cooper, who was allegedly Howard Hughes in an airplane. and he said that Hughes was in Nicaragua in 1972. There's been no proof that Hughes was ever seen after 1968, and there is a lot of reason to believe that this was the Hughes double. A man who's made a movie on Howard Hughes that has never been produced, that I had a part in, and it's been squelched. He's from Nicaragua, and he knew Somoza, worked with him, and said, "How did you know that was Howard Hughes?" He wanted to check out. That was on the airplane. He'd never seen him before. And he said, "Because he gave me an airplane." He got a 747, the only airline in Nicaragua, and that's how he knew it was Howard Hughes, because he got an airplane. The Sandinistas started to attack him in 1974. He went to Homestead Air Force Base in Florida in 1979, and then went down to Paraguay with a dictatorship down there where he was provided a lot of land and protection, but he lived it up, and he was a pain in the neck, if not the buttocks, to the government down there because of his conspicuous consumption, and there was a lot of talk that he was going to be moved out. He, like the Shah, had nowhere to go. He was an embarrassment, and he was messing around with a woman that he shouldn't have been messing around with. The two men that represented the United States at his funeral, as I say, one wasn't Richard Nixon. One was Larry McDonald from Georgia, and Representative John Murphy of New York. Murphy's also on the board of foundation, the Pahlavi Foundation, worked closely with the Shah, the Central Intelligence Agency, with Somoza, and the dictatorships. And Larry McDonald has been mentioned in documents as being part of that narcotic gun-running organizing team that was responsible for the killing of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, again involving the Stoner operation and the assassination team, Mitchell Werbell and the gang in Georgia. The silencers, the weapons were provided from there. Larry McDonald is as far right as you can get in Congress, and he went down to Miami to the funeral to laud Somoza. Of course, the Nicaraguans are furious at Jimmy Carter, and when they begin carrying signs, "Death to Carter," you realize that this is a well-trained team of people that wouldn't blink twice to shoot, particularly as these terrorists from the right are well-armed. They're protected by the press. They're protected by the Justice Department. They can blow up Letelier in Washington and get out, and the other trial will be bungled. They can kill an attaché from the United Nations, and they've had bombings all over the country and murders all over the country. And when a president is killed and a senator running for president is killed and civil rights leaders are killed and witnesses to the trials are killed, then it's easy to take a pot shot at Jimmy Carter. And if this group gets mad enough, they may just do that. Speaking of assassinations, it shouldn't bother me, but it really irks me to see Ronald Reagan with William Simon and his gang at the home in Virginia that was built for John Kennedy. Kennedy didn't like the home, but there's a lot of photographs of them sitting in the patio these days just laughing it up. William Simon was the gentleman from the cabinet of Ford and Nixon who believed that the multinational Arabs and other countries would not have to reveal how much of the United States they own in terms of business, farmlands, banks, investments, that they should be allowed to keep that secret. Ronald Reagan and his family and gang are assembled conspicuously in the home that belonged to John Kennedy. And then this last week, Richard Nixon was with Rebozo up at Edgartown on Mr. Albanap's yacht at Martha Vineyard, looking around for property close to Jackie Onassis where Ronald Reagan can have a summer home. It does rile me to see them rubbing it in, because that was the scene of Chappaquiddick that knocked Ted Kennedy out of the election in 1972 with the death of Mary Jo Kopechne and Nixon's White House plumbers up there at the time and never questioned afterwards. There are two stories that I cannot possibly do in the next 2 minutes. I'll mention them and go into them hopefully next week in detail. One is the story, Japanese recover the Tsarist treasure. Those of you that have followed my tapes and radio programs know that I've talked about the sinking of the Awa Maru, the Tsarist treasures that were taken by Japan and the United States after World War II down to Hong Kong and sunk so that they could be brought up for the billions of dollars of wealth later. And I believe that the Glomar Explorer. Again, the CIA ship built by our tax money under the user organization will be used to bring that ship up. Well, this week was the first article I've seen admitting that the Tsarist treasure, one of them, is sunk outside of Tokyo, and they're bringing up $200,000 block of solid platinum. There's all kinds of precious metals. A Russian ship was sunk by the Japanese in the war 1904-1905. It is filled with Tsarist treasures, gold, and money, and the Japanese are going to bring that ship up. The important thing is the admission of the Tsarist treasures that were taken out of Russia at the time. The other subject I do want to bring up next week is the death of Art Linkletter's son. He was killed in an automobile accident, and I have hinted many times or suggested through a letter that I have that went to a judge at the time of the trial of John Frazier for the killing of the Oda family in California, that Robert Linkletter was the Zodiac. Now that he's dead, I feel it's safe that I can mention that I did call David Tosh, the chief of police in San Francisco in 1976, and talked to him about this. He said they would never bring him in, that they had this information, that they didn't clear it, they had no interest in pursuing it, and it's a subject that has to do with a massive entanglement of California violences, and Mr. Tashi was later removed from the police department for forging letters of the Zodiac killer in San Francisco. Now, I'm not saying this is true or not true. It'll be interesting to see if the Zodiac letters or that person ever surfaces again. But next week, I'll read to you a letter that was sent to the judge about a group of the white organization. It's like the Hooded Ones, the Cagoulards in France. It has to do with an organization of killers called the International White Guard. And this letter to the judge at the time of a trial did mention Robert Linkletter. He was killed this last week in an automobile accident. No charges have been filed against the head-on collision. We'll bring that up next week because there isn't time for the details, and it has to do with Reagan and California violences. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and keep clipping those papers. If you write to me at Box 22511, Carmel 93923, I can send a printed bibliography of sources of information for this tape. Don't send it to the station. I can only get here once a week. You can send it to the P.O. Box in Carmel. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. I'll be back with you next week and go into more detail on those last two items that I just mentioned.
Thank you, Mae. Takes us to 11 o'clock. This is KLRB Carmel, Monterey. Good evening.